This is Homebase Nation.
So we're here with Dr. Ross Zafonte, who is professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School and Spalding Rehab, Mass General Hospital, and really the lead behind traumatic brain injury here at Homebase. And thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us, Ron.
And Brigadier General Jack Hammond is here with us, Executive Director at Homebase, and really happy that you're here as well.
Thanks, Ron.
And then we have Michael Allard, who's had a perspective over 10 years at Homebase as the Chief Operating Officer. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. It's great to be here.
So let me start with General Hammond. There's a lot going on recently, as we know in the news, about these injuries. And I wanted to hear from you because you have a perspective on the soldiers coming back and what they need and what these families need, of course, here at Homebase. But you actually have a different perspective, or a unique perspective, because you were there. And you've been there, I think it was 2003 in Fallujah that you observed many IED blasts, injuries, and different traumatic injuries. And that was pre-protocol. That was before we had a real way of treating the knowledge behind it and how we treat these injuries. And then you went back in post 9/11 Afghanistan. Well, I kind of wanted to hear about that transition and just your experience in looking back at those injuries.
Sure. So first thing I'd say is, you know, when we first went into Afghanistan and Iraq back in 2002 and 3, these were not injuries that we even discussed. Post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, the unseen wounds really weren't anything that came up on our screens. And we had a number of soldiers in Fallujah that received blast injuries from RPGs, roadside bombs, mortars, rockets, hand grenades. And the key for us was if you were able to walk away, we high-fived. We had guys that were blown up by IEDs that were very fortunate on one day driving a fiberglass Humvee that was blown up in the air 5 feet, and they had a little trickle of blood coming out of their ears. And they were just excited that they were still around. On the same day in a different part of the city, we'd have an M1 Abrams tank incinerated and blown to pieces. So it was the luck of the draw, and we didn't really look at it, you know, as an injury. Right. We looked at it as, well, you know, you rub some dirt on it and keep moving, because that's what's ingrained in all of us is you continue to march, you continue to fight, and we play hurt. And
not unlike, you know, obviously the analogy of our NFL friends, where we used to say, how many fingers do I have up? And what's happened in that field. I'll have to tell Dr. Zafonte, yeah.
That would be it. I mean, we just looked at you, are you okay? Yep, okay. And that was the answer anyway. And as you flash forward, we started seeing the effect of these injuries, especially on multiple deployments and multiple concussive events. And by 2004 and 5, we started seeing an increase in suicide rate. We started seeing some of the other effects of traumatic brain injury with cognitive stuff. And so when I went back to Afghanistan in 2010, 11, and 12, we had protocols in place so that we had blast injuries. And when the average person, when they try and wrap their head around a blast injury, it's just too hard. When you look at the injuries when they take place, we had a vehicle stuffed with 600 pounds of TNT hit an armored bus, a 30-ton bus that incinerated 17 people instantly and threw that bus 90 feet in the air. So you think about the impact of that, and being exposed to that type of trauma, it's got to have an impact.
Well, on that note, that's quite a visual, and thanks for sharing that. Dr. Zafonte, Ross, what's going on in the brain when that happens? What do we know about it, and why is it important?
So, Ron, I think we need to take two steps on this one. First is, how common is this injury, to kind of give us a overall playing field. And when we think about it, there is some data that suggests that it's 1 in 5 service members coming back from these conflicts that have been exposed, probably several hundred thousand, some reports nearly 300,000. So extremely common. The good news part is that many can get better quickly with proper treatment. Now, what happens in a concussive event is some form of external force. That could be something hitting your head, that could be an auto accident, or that could be a blast wave. And we generally believe that it's an energy mismatch. You need more than you can provide that causes the concern.
Sure. You think we're thinking about the same type of thing when we have our classic roadside bomb versus we know that a missile came in?
Well, there haven't been a lot of studies on missiles, but what we know is that these very, very high impact weapons produce different levels of forces, and then those forces, in theory, can go through one's ears, eyes, nose, and visceral organs, your organs, to your brain, and they may produce a bit of a different pattern of injury. What is clear and good is that people need to be recognized. These symptoms are real. Getting early treatment means a lot. Later on, there are susceptibilities, challenges, and problems that people can sustain. And so getting people recognized, getting them treated, and making sure that this is dealt with appropriately and early. So there really is no such thing as a mild brain injury.
General Hammond, you had a thought on that.
Yeah, I just, it's put it in perspective. I mentioned a moment ago the impact of about a 600-pound explosive device on a 30-ton armored vehicle. The ballistic missiles that were fired recently carry a payload of about 1,600 pounds of explosives. And so the detonation that occurs around that is significant, and it's enough to, it actually blew up metal housing units, mess halls, and things over in Al-Assad. The soldiers were protected in these concrete bunkers, but if you take a look at what they are, and they're probably the same ones that were there when I was overseas, they're almost like a U-shaped bunker meant for overhead protection, but both ends are open. So there's a lot of space for that explosive blast to come in from the side. So they're still very exposed. They're protected from the shrapnel, but not the concussive event that Dr. Zafonte speaks about.
As we talk about that wave.
Yeah, and to go with what the general said, these waves bounce, and they bounce off walls, and they come back and double hit you. So they're very difficult to completely protect from.
Fortunately, unfortunately, it's kind of this double-edged sword, right? We've learned, people have learned around the country, and there's been a lot of work here at Homebase over, how many years, 14 years now, really with the huge number of service members that have come over with head injury. So in a sense, it's a terrible thing that's happened, but the opportunity is that we've actually learned so much. So I wanted to hear a little bit about that from you, Michael, from a programmatic perspective, and sort of, how do we treat these service members and their families?
Yeah, so there's good news and bad news over the past decade, and we've come a long way. And so when you look at 10 years ago and what took place from impact on the battlefield to coming home to coming back into civilian life, what was existing over a decade ago was very little, as General Hammond and Russ had alluded to. And what we have today is a much better system of care, not only within the military, which is frankly one of the best in the world. When you look at over a 90% when you look at over 90% of those who are injured in the battlefield, and if they get back to a forward operating base and proper care, that there's a survival rate, and that's incredible. But what wasn't in place 10 years ago was the longitudinal system that could be in place for traumatic brain injuries. And just take a look at the 34 who were injured in Iraq, and make no doubt they were injured. And so 17 of those 34 were flown to Landstuhl. And of those 17 who were at Landstuhl, 8 came home, which was likely at either Walter Reed or Brooke Army Medical Center. And so the military is a very sophisticated system of being able to get levels of injuries to the places that they need. And if you get the launch stool, it's a very serious situation. If they're coming home to the United States, it is even more serious. And then from a living with injuries perspective, being able to rehabilitate, which many people can do, but then come into the civilian life. What wasn't in place 10 years ago was these systems of care and places like Homebase, which could work with our DOD and our VA counterparts and develop novel models of interventions that frankly got after these issues in a much bigger way and was able to really make a significant injury, which in some cases can result in death from a suicide rate, which there are linkages there with brain injury, to being able to thrive once they come home. And so we've gone a long way. But this is an important issue that we cannot lose sight of. The fact that we are existing within a condition that doesn't have a lot of visibility still in the public consciousness.
I think that's spot on, and I think that what tells us almost a heralding about this, as Michael said, is that a significant portion of that group was taken to Germany, where there are substantial resources, and a subset was taken to the United States.
And Longstools in Germany is the biggest.
It's enormous. It's an enormous facility, and they have enormous capabilities. And then another group came back to the United States. So doing the right thing for people early on, as we said, is critical. Getting them to the right level of care is critical.
So to wrap your head around it and get your mind's eye visually looking at this, when you're injured, you get taken to a significant combat Army Surgical Hospital at Allard Air Base or Bagram in Afghanistan, and they have incredible capabilities to solve problems right there, because that's a big deal. Sure. Because you bring them from another part of a country, you medevac them on a helicopter to go there. They have significant resources. To then take soldiers and then place them in an air medevac plane, that's a significant resource. It's a hospital ambulance flight to Germany. So you're flying to another continent for treatment. Right. We don't do that lightly.
Well, and I remember Bob Woodruff would talk about in Allard, they were able to basically open up his skull at that time. I think it was 2006, and talk about an emergency room. I mean, they were basically trying to get the hospital bed upstairs, and that was in Longstool, and that's a major undertaking. Now we know that, thankfully, of these 34, I'm not so sure that the injuries were on the severe end, but I wanted to take that back and sort of step back and talk about brain injury a little bit more, because we use these words like severe and even mild, which we don't like. But really, it's the long-term effects of even the, quote, mild.
When we think about it, it's critical for us to appreciate that there could be some longer-term sequelae. The vast majority of people treated well early on will get better, 90–95%.
What's early?
Well, that's the critical issue. We believe, anyway, that early intervention for people, recognition, diagnosis, amelioration of symptoms, puts them on a path for doing a bit better. The longer-term sequelae can be things like headaches, cognitive problems, emotional-related issues, balance-related concerns, visual-related symptomatology, and many others.
And when we talk about early treatment and identification, what have we learned, Michael, in the last 10 years?
Yeah, so here's the good news. We've learned a lot. And what we've learned is that these are injuries that are a decade ago little understood. We in the field of medicine, I would say, as we all know, we were just grasping sort of the long-term impacts of this, and folks like Dr. Zafonte, I think, had a more longitudinal view of it. But what we know is that if the persons that are close to you cannot recognize or understand what a brain injury is, and you have a brain injury, and you may be struggling with all of the emotions that are going into this, then you're not going to go to the most important step, which is to put yourself into somebody's care. And we've learned that that is a team effort, and it starts with the family, and it starts with approaches in which that family member can really readily understand it and then know where to go. And this is an area where I think we've had our best learnings in our best development, because, you know, one of the things that Homebase had recognized back in 2009 was that the family members were absent, and the education around this was nowhere. And so when you can begin to educate those family members, begin to understand that there are resources out there that will take them in and coach them through it to get that veteran into care, now you're making progress, and you can put it into the hands of the clinicians who do have a good handle on where we should go with the actual care.
I'd also like to add, you know, some of the wonderful innovation and success stories we've had because of the deep resources that we're able to access here at Homebase between Spaulding Rehab and the Mass General Hospital. This past weekend, Michael and I were down in Florida, where we do a run to Homebase, and we have a program in Southwest Florida. And one of our former patients was there joining us. And when I first met this young man 7 years ago, he was a severely injured paratrooper with a significant traumatic brain injury that when I met him, he was in a wheelchair, barely able to communicate. Nothing filled my heart with greater joy than watching him this year, walking the 2 miles and having a conversation with him. An amazing young kid, and he had an incredible family support network. He's found all the right care, and you can see what would have happened in other circumstances, in previous wars and previous situations. He would have been warehoused in a nursing home for the rest of his life. And with the care he received from Dr. Zafonte and the team here, he's now thriving in his own way.
So that's incredible. So the three of you, I guess, as we finish up, I want to talk about the military-civilian divide, another word that we don't love, the military-civilian connection. So what I mean by that is these systems of care. There's been so many injuries over the years, and I say fortunately, unfortunately, because we now have systems. There's great things about the VA and the federal systems. There's great things about the private sector. What do we think, how does that marriage work the best? What have we learned that is the best part of that relationship?
You know, at least from my perspective, I think Homebase has been a unique starter of a flame that was necessary to really look at private-public partnerships, to really look at how we can serve as a complementary resource for people who need access to care, access through their families, as Michael pointed out, access for people who have difficult symptom complexes chronically, access for people who have unusual parts of that diagnosis, not to be exclusive of the VA, but to collaborate with the VA for a single purpose, getting the veteran well.
We know, and this is no commentary about the VA, because as was said before, there's some wonderful clinicians at the VA, but less than half of all the U.S. veterans in this country are enrolled in the VA, and less than half of that are actually seeking any type of care around these invisible wounds. And so access is key, but it's also the perception that that veteran can feel like there's a comfort level for them to take that step forward. And it's stigma, but it's also, as we've talked about, you know, your family members being surrounded and helping you to do that, and it's identity. It's being able to say, okay, no matter what point of entry I go into, I'm going to have faith that they're going to get it right, and that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing in healthcare, as you guys know, but it's particularly difficult in the veteran community, and so, you know, there are elements that are incredibly strong with Homebase and others that have gone down this journey with us, where we frankly have an advantage. We're not a government organization, and for whether that perception is right or wrong, there's goodness in that, and which will allow these veterans to get the care that they need, and ultimately recognize that brain injury is an injury. You know, PTS is an injury, and so we can heal from it, but you got to get to that clinical care.
Yeah, now I just want to add one other thing to Michael's excellent point, which is this hasn't been opposing forces. This has been a collaborative series, and the collaboration is not only here where we see patients, but it's been a collaboration broadly on a research front where we've really sought and learned a lot about how people get better, how to help them get better, innovate, and really to focus on each person getting one day better every day.
So I know you talk a lot about the fact that Homebase and this podcast in particular are based on the philosophy that we have that it's a product of a grateful nation and people's support. And it was born based on a visit by the Red Sox to Walter Reed as part of that grateful nation and a recognition that these invisible wounds were underserved, underrepresented, and really needed a great deal of help. So that was like that's why Homebase started, was because of these invisible wounds and the recognition that they needed a lot of work. As you look forward, you know, we have some phenomenal people in the world that support Homebase. The American people are great, but they see the positive side and the very heroic side of the military. Oftentimes, they'll see these amazing raids where they'll seize Osama bin Laden or al-Baghdadi or some of these other, you know, treacherous, you know, horrible people, or where there's great rescue operations where these Delta Force guys and Navy SEALs and Green Berets do these amazing things. What they don't see is the other side, the effect of a career of these concussive events and what they take, the toll they take on these young men and women.
Families certainly see that every day.
They don't see the fact that we had a 300% increase in suicides amongst our Special Operations Forces in 2017 and 2018, which can be attributed to some of these injuries. So the challenge is now, what do we do with them? How do we treat these amazing folks that have done so much for us? And that's why this innovation takes place. But at Homebase, we also see the effects on their families. We see these Gold Star and families of the fallen that have lost service members because they were able to survive the crucible of battle, but not survive the raging war that goes on inside their brains and between their ears. The pain of those headaches that just don't go away. And all these other different things that can cause challenges. And we see the after effects of those families, and we have to treat them as well. So one of the things we always safeguard is that stigma is real, and anything that deters somebody from coming to get the help they need over something as silly as a stigma is painful for us to see. And we want to make sure that people understand these are legitimate and serious wounds. They now rate a Purple Heart just as a shrapnel wound or a bullet hole will. And we need to treat them and constantly safeguard against that stigma so that men and women don't refuse to get care or acknowledge these injuries and then live a miserable life because they're afraid to get care.
It's so appreciated. I'm so appreciative of the way that you put that, General. And I wanted to circle back to that. When we first talked about your experience in 2003 with these injured guys and gals with blood coming out of their ear after that blast, and then they went right back. How you doing? Okay, high five, I'm back. What if you talked with those people right now? What kind of conversation, how has the conversation changed if you talk with them and their families?
So it's interesting, and I have the opportunity to meet with some of these folks, and I've lost some of those folks after coming home. And that's always one of the most heartbreaking pieces. Our warriors are pretty resilient in the sense that whether they're guys like Travis Mills that you've talked with, quadruple amputee, no regrets. I think that's a pretty common theme. I've had a soldier with a brain injury based on a roadside bomb that lost a quarter of his head. And he returned to duty because of that drive to get back and continue to serve. And again, no regrets. I think a lot of them would love to have known they could have got a little care sooner. But they don't really look in the rearview mirror a lot. So they're happy for the guys that get the treatment now, and they would be advocates for the young men and women that are coming out to make sure they get the help as soon as possible for these treatments.
I want to raise 2 points to this wonderful discussion, one of which is our special operator community, which the General so appropriately touched on. This is a group of people who are taking a disproportionate level of exposure, and Homebase has devoted significant resources to trying to meet their needs, which may in some ways be a bit different from an exposure perspective. But number two is the question of toughing it through. The one we have seen for years in sport and in the military. And what we have learned clearly is that when you put an injury on top of an injury on top of an injury, the outcome is not quite as good. The longer-term sequelae, the longer-term problems are much more distinct, and the risk for other problems are much higher than if we all learn to say, whether they're athletes or military service members, time out. And what we're beginning to see in the athlete community is people raising their hand and getting an appreciation of that, although not as much as we'd like. It's better. And I think we're starting now, just now, to see it in the military community.
So the Super Bowl is coming up soon, and Patriots are not in it, as you may have heard. We've learned so much in that space over 10, 15 years. What I find, and that's a good thing, because these guys on the field are getting the care they need, and I think we're doing timeouts when we should. But what I think we can learn from that is that, true, it's exciting and it's important to get these guys back on the field and playing at top notch. But if you use that analogy to our military friends that were just injured, if we channel some of that energy, some of that money, some of that thought towards people like that, I think that's a good thing.
I think that's unquestioned, right? So the issue is not only how to treat people longer term, which is critically important to me and others, but it is how do we screen people early on? How do we appropriately limit their re-exposure to an injury? How do we get them to the right level of care, whether that's Germany, the United States, a local system within the country that they're operating? And how do we prevent the longer-term problems for people? And I think if we do those things and devote those kinds of resources, I think we'll see some very positive kinds of outcomes.
So I want to ask the two doctors and General Hammond a question. So we've come through 10 years of pretty extraordinary progress. What does it look like 10 years from now? You know, when we think about brain injury, how military and our veterans are cared for, what do you think is going to happen, and what would you like to see happen?
So maybe I'll start. So thinking about it from both a clinical care and a research perspective, because it's our belief here that research will hopefully inform clinical care. That's what, in part, it's all about. We'll be able to understand injury patterns in a better way. So what we see is that people with various sorts of injuries recover in many, many different paths. It's not a singular path. And we'll be able to use sophisticated blood-based markers, or even perhaps their saliva, a better understanding of the way imaging or other testing might tell us, and an enhanced understanding of what happens to people acutely and what does that mean longer term, and put them on almost a personalized guided path for their own recovery, for what they need. I think that's a place that we're going to get to, precision or person-focused therapies.
And you know, I'll leave the research and more of the higher level stuff to my chairman here that I could not imagine speaking so eloquently about. What I think about with that question is the connection of disability. So as rehabilitation physicians or physiatrists, hearkening back to our first rounding on the wards in this space, even in my shorter career of, 15 years, I've seen less stigma in disability over 5, 10, 15 years. So what I think in 10 years is that brain injury is going to be a little bit more tangible to people because it's invisible. And so how is that type of injury going to be sort of looked at in more of that classic physical, you mentioned amputees, spinal cord injury, things like that. So I think that's a big goal that's going to happen more in the next 10 years.
So from my perspective, as a former military leader, I think having a point of injury detection capability that enables us and would provide me with the tools to know, can this soldier go on, or do we need to move them out for their own best interest? By nature, we train our soldiers to play hurt, and we have to continue to train them to play hurt, because if you're in the middle of an operation, there's two choices. You're either injured or you're hurt. If you're hurt, we teach them to suck it up and move on. That's the nature of the work we do. If you're injured, you need a medevac, and that means the mission gets derailed, helicopter comes in, you scrub the mission, and you start another day. So it's a pretty big jump. The challenge we have is, now what, when we get back to the base camp, we know there's an injury. Do they suck it up and continue to go on because they can, based on the protocols Ross helped to develop, or do we have to evacuate them to Landstuhl or back to the U.S.? And that's the key, that we need that determination as a commander to make, so that we don't further hurt somebody, or we allow somebody to do their job.
So what I'm getting at here is that, to just sort of summarize that 10-year, Michael's 10-year forecast question is really the bench, the research, the science behind brain injury, A. B, the systems of care that you're getting at, General, and C, sort of the social, if I can quote myself, the social aspect of disability and stigma. I want to thank you guys. It's been a really rich conversation, and I know you're really busy, and just to have you all in the same room has been wonderful. I'm very grateful for that. You know, you talk about a grateful nation, and let's hope that these veterans and service members get the care they need and their families.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.